There's a sugya at the beginning of Masechet Ketuvot that really branches out throughout so many sugyas in Shas and has tremendous repercussions. The Gemara wants to know, why is it that although the Mishnah establishes that Psula Nitzes L'Yom Haravi, that a woman who's getting married for the first time should be married on the fourth day of the week, Wednesday night, and yet the Gemara quotes a brayso on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, Misakana v'elech, we'll see what that means, is Nagu ha'am, there was a minhag amongst the people, like a grassroots minhag, to get married on a Tuesday instead of Wednesday. The Chacham did not object. So the Gemara now analyzes my sakana. What does sakana mean? So the Gemara goes through two possibilities, rejecting the first, until finally maskana is tiboil lehegmon tchil. So there was a gzera on the part of the Malchus. We're not sure if it's at the time of the Greeks or maybe at the time of the Romans, that the Hegmon would have Be'ila with the Kala before she would be brought to the Chup. So the Gemara says, why is that called Sakana? Why does the Brisa call that Sakana? Whose life is in danger? We're only talking about an onus, situation of rape, which is bad enough, but it's not Sakana, the word Sakana. So the Gemara gives two answers. We're going to leave out the second answer. We're going to focus just today on the first answer. Mishum Tznuos. And these tznuos are women who are convinced that in such a situation of tiboil hegmon tefila, they would have to give up their lives rather than submit themselves to this violation. So Tosfos says, is there some sort of halachic basis for their tznius? Is it just a mid of tznius? They want to give up their lives? So if you look carefully at the Gemara says, lidrosh lahudi onesh shari. There's no reason to call this sakana. We can solve the problem. We can circumvent the sakana, avoid it by simply darshaning, by publicly announcing that they're allowed to submit themselves to this act of what we would call gili arat. So Tosfos right away, lidrash ludon shari, here on Taf Gimel Amud Beis raises the following objection. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin, Taf Ayin Daled Amud Beis, that there are Gimel Averos Chamuros, meaning that in general the rule is v'chai bohem v'lo shiyomus bohem, and the Torah is docha any avera for the sake of pikuach nefesh. But there are three exceptions to that rule. In the case of avodah zarah, the Gemara derives the exception from the pasuk b'chol levavcha afilu b'chol nafshecha afilu no telas nafshecha. If a person forces you at gunpoint to worship avodah zarah, you would have to avoid doing so, even if it means giving up your life. The Gemara then goes on to say, what about Ritzicha? And the Gemara says in Ritzicha, we don't have a basis. We don't have a pasuk or a yalfusa. We're going to have to derive it from a svara. Also, just to test you, does anybody remember the excellent, yeah. So who says that your blood is redder than his? In other words, as Rashi explains it, which nefesh is more yakar b'yeinei Hashem? You can't decide that. You can't play God, and therefore, according to the Gemara, you can't kill someone as katla leploni v'akat lo akatla lecha. You don't kill someone, I'll kill you. You have to allow yourself to be killed rather than kill him. What happened to pikuach nefesh? What happened to v'chai bohem? So the answer is we have a svara of my chazis. Okay, we'll get into that in just a minute. In the case of Gili Arayis, the Gemara says, what's the source? And the Gemara says, it's a hekesh. The Torah in the parsha of Naira Hamurasa, the Torah says, Keina Dobra Zeh. It's like someone who's a victim of murder. In any event, the Gemara establishes in the Masechet Sanhedrin a hekesh, which equates Ritzicha and Gili Arayis, meaning just like in Ritzicha, rather than kill someone, you have to allow yourself to be killed. So too, in the case of Gili Arayis, she would have to allow herself to be killed rather than submit herself to Gili Arayis. The Tosfos therefore asks, what does the Gemara mean when it says here in Ksubis, the lidrash lehu di onis shari? What do you mean onis shari? On a shari, it's Gili Arayas. Now, there are a number of answers to this question. Tosfos quotes two of them. One answer is that in the case of Hegmon, because he is a Nochri, a guy, and Tosfos now in the name of any Tam invokes a pasuk in Yechezkel Hanavi. It says Zirma Susin Zirmaso, and we're going to derive from that pasuk that there's no chiyuv of Gili Arayas of Yeharg Val Yavar in the case of a guy. So therefore, there would be no objection to their submitting themselves to the Bila of the Hegmon because the Hegmon is a guy. That's Rabbeinu Tam. Many Rishonim reject Rabbeinu Tam. Good to see you. And they hold that no, there's no such thing as a distinction between the Boel who's in Nochri and the Boel who's Yisrael. In both cases, there's Gili Arayas and there's Yeharg Val Yavam. So therefore, we're forced to find another explanation to justify the Lidrash Lahu, the Onus Shari. How could Onus be mutter when it's a case of Gili Arayas? Now, in the case of Esther, which we'll get to in just a minute, some are of the opinion, this is a big machlokes in the Gemara, whether Esther was married to Mordechai or not. If she was married to Mordechai, then we have a problem how Esther would be able to submit herself to have a relationship with Achashverosh because she's married to Mordechai. And that would be Gili Arayas, she'd have to give up her life. So if you go with Rabbeinu Tam, it's very good. Everything is smooth. We call it glat. Because then we're talking about Achashverosh who's a guy, just like the Hegmon here is a guy in Ksubis, is then religious Ludona Shari. There's no Gili Arayas. But if you hold A, that Esther was married to Mordechai, and B, against Rabbeinu Tam, like the Rivam, the Balei Tosfos, who hold that even in the case of Nochri, there's Yeharg Val Yavar, it's Gili Arayas, then we have to understand Esther. That's one problem. And we have to understand our Gemara Ksubis, Lidrash Lahu the Ones Shari. How can we be mated them to give up, to submit themselves to an act of beer with the Hegmon, because we're holding now that for Gili Arayas, you have to give up your life. So what would be the heter in a case of Akum if you reject Rabbeinu Tam, you hold like the Rivam? So again, just to summarize, according to those Rishonim, yeah, good, how are you? According to those Rishonim, we'll hold that even in the case of a guy, there's Yeharg Val Yavar. And since we're talking about an Ashes speech, because we're between Erison and Such, this is a full-fledged Ashes. How can we justify the Gemara and say Lidrash Ludona Shari? If you accept Rabbeinu Tam, then okay, we talk about a Hegmon as a Nachri. But if you reject Rabbeinu Tam, you hold that even in the case of Bias Akum, there's Yeharg Val Yavar. How can we matir her to submit ourselves to the Hegmon when it's Gili Arayas? It should be Yeharg Val Yavar. Okay. The Tosfos says the following. The Gemara asks, as we said before about Esther in Sanhedrin Ayin Daled Amud Beis, how could Esther submit herself to a relationship with Achashverosh, assuming she was married to Mordechai? It's Gili Arayas, it should be Yeharg Val Yavar. So the Gemara gives two answers. We're going to focus on Abai. Abai's answer is Karka Olam Shiny. This is a famous Gemara of Karka Olam, which means, just to simplify, that since she's passive and she's not actively involved in the act of Gili Arayas, therefore it's mutter. Now, what happened to Yeharg Val Yavar? You could say that maybe what the Gemara has in mind is that since she's Karka Olam, therefore there's no violation of the Avera. But no one says such a thing. Everyone assumes that there are two ways of violating Gili Arayas. The Gemara says in the Masechet Krisos that a woman in Gili Arayas will get the same capital punishment as a man. So the Gemara asks, but where's the Avera on her part? She was passive. So the Gemara says there's a pasuk that says v'nichritzu hanefashos ha'osos, and because it says nefashos ha'osos in the plural, it's teaching us that her din is identical to his, even though he's the active violator and she's only passive. She's Karka Olam. Nevertheless, it's considered osos as if she was actively involved in Gili Arayas. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that Gili Arayas will apply as an Avera and a capital crime to boot, and Yeharg Val Yavar, both if it's Karka Olam or if it's not Karka Olam, whether it's active Zakovid Maisa or it's Karka Olam. In both cases, it's considered a violation of Gili Arayas. So we're back to square one in a sense. We don't understand how the Gemara could justify Esther, and in our Gemara justify the drasha that we're going to teach the Tznuos based on Karka Ol.
But aren't you still left with even understanding Abaya's, his answer?
Correct.
Karka Ol Shani, what is the basis for that answer?
So it's interesting. The Gemara actually never addresses the question of Gili Arayis in Esther. The Gemara only addresses the question of Farhesia. And the Rishonim want to know, why did they leave out Gili Arayis? Rabbeinu Tam is very smooth, because Rabbeinu Tam holds that in Bias Nochri, in Achashverosh, there is no Yehar Gal Yavar. So the Gemara wasn't objecting to Esther's behavior based on Gili Arayis. The Gemara is only based on Farhesia. Okay, now we have to understand what Farhesia means and how it works, but let's just oversimplify it and say that Farhesia is Machayev you for any Avera whatsoever, even if it's a low-grade Avera, if it's Farhesia, and in the case of Esther, it was public knowledge that she was having relations with Achashverosh, and therefore the Gemara thought that Karka Ola would not make any difference. Here's where Abaye steps up to the plate, as we would say in baseball, and he says, Karka Olam Shiny, that even as far as Farhesia, which the Machayev is Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem, even there's a distinction between actively being Machal Shem Shemayim and passive. Okay. So now we get to Karka Olam. Yeah.
Abaye's Chiddush, I think, is extending Karka Olam to Esther's case. We're still with our Sugya. The pasuk that we quoted before indicates that when a woman gets raped, in most cases, it's not that she's giving a choice. Either it doesn't seem like she's giving a choice. Either I'll kill you or you're raped. It's forcefully taken. I think the idea of Karka Olam, that's the pasuk itself. When a woman gets raped, she didn't do anything. It's as if she was murdered. But
again,
she didn't do anything.
I just object on one count, Neil. The Gemara says that the Tznuos decided to give up their life, meaning they were given a choice. Apparently, they could have avoided the Gili Arayis. And Tosaf is asking, why would they be allowed, even if they weren't Tznuos, to avoid giving up their lives? Here's a case where, in order to avoid Gili Arayis, you would have to give up your life. So we're not talking about a case where they're forcefully raping her. It is a rape situation, but not the way you said it. It's not that she's an object, but that her submitting herself to Gili Arayis is Karka Olam. She didn't actively involve herself in the physical act of intimacy. He was the active element, and she was passive. But she could have easily have avoided. If she would have ran away, they would have killed her, and she would give up her life because she's a tznuah. So the Gemara asks, why not just avoid the whole problem? Circumvent the issue of tznuos by making a public drasha, getting on the bima, clapping off the pitch, and notifying everyone that in this case, if Chas v'Shalom, the Hegman comes, then she's allowed to submit herself. As I state in the Gemara. So Tosaf says, what do you mean she's allowed to submit herself? We have a problem here of Gili Arayis, we have a Rabbeinu Tam's answer, and now we have the Rivam's answer. The Rivam's answer is that Karka Olam shine. That Karka Olam is a mitigating circumstance, and therefore she'd be allowed to submit herself. She doesn't have to run away and get killed because it's Karka Olam and she's not actively involved. Now, what you have in front of you is the Rambam and Reb Chaim. This is the first Reb Chaim in the Sefer, so I'm very excited that we started our project of learning through the entire Sefer of Reb Chaim, which will take us about 10 years. In any event, so Reb Chaim is Medayek in the Lashon Rambam. Now, what you have here in front of you on this page is the second half of Halacha Aleph. I just want to add the opening line of the Rambam, which is not here on your page. The Rambam writes the following: Kol Beis Yisrael, I emphasize, Kol Beis Yisrael, Mitzuvim al Kiddush Hashem Hagadol, etc., etc. Now, when you hear the words Kol Beis Yisrael, who is the Rambam addressing when he talks about the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem? Men and women. I mean, Kol Beis Yisrael clearly indicates that we're talking about both men and women. And then the Rambam said,
Rambam, when he goes Kol Beis Yisrael, speaking men and women, or just we're saying that the expression implies?
I think that's what the Rambam meant. I honestly believe there are all sorts of jokes about that, yeah. What if the Rambam was here, what would he say? After all the chidushim that everyone says in the Rambam. In this case, I think, again, I'm just telling you, the Rambam would not have approval. What I meant by Kol Beis Yisrael is that there's no mitzvah sasei man grama here. Women are not exempt. The Rambam later on in Tzitzis and in Trilin is going to exempt women. Here, there's no exemption. We're all in the same boat. Kol Beis Yisrael b'tzurim al kiddush Hashem Hagod. Then the Rambam says that in general we have a principle called v'chai bohem, and pikuach nefesh is doche. But the Rambam goes on to say that there are 3 exceptions. So that's what you'll see here. Kishiyamod nochri v'ya'anes es Yisrael lavar al achas mikol mitzvahs hamuras b'tor blah 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 blah. B'mei dvarim b'shar mitzvahs chutz mi'avodah zarah v'gilurei shlichus tov. Aval sholosh averos elu. Excuse me. Im yomar lo avar al achas mihen o tehareg. You see, I think the word tehareg is in the Lashon Nekeva. I'm not sure. Oh, tehareg, but let's not get off on a tangent. I just because our time is right. Yehareg al yavar. So the Rambam says Yehareg al yavar in 3 cases. Which one is most exciting for us now? Most relevant? Hili Arayis, correct? Now notice something.
Right.
So that already. Meaning you can't
Oh.
argue that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, the Rambam is not like Rabbeinu Tam. The Rambam, in the case of Esther, is going to have to come up with some explanation why Esther would not have to give up her life. Correct. And it could be the Rambam holds, by the way, that Esther was not married to Mordechai. We don't know.
What could be
But here
the,
the Noach is not something one of the things. It's
exactly.
one who's forcing to do the Avera. Noach is getting out and telling you the adultery that was I'm going to kill you.
Could be. We don't know. I mean, the Rambam doesn't give us a clear. He says Yamod.
It's not Biyanus. Sorry, it's not that much clear. That's not saying he's raping.
He's saying
Forcing her.
what's
do
the
one of the
like?
mitzvahs, or else I'm going to kill you. Do one of the Avera, so I'm going to kill you.
Yomer lo avar. Yeah, it could be. It's possible. Daniel might be right. Maybe he's forcing, he and her to have a relationship, and he's Jewish and she's Jewish. I don't know. But you certainly get the impression that he's addressing both men and women here in Gilead rights. So if you fast forward after Reb Chaim brings down the whole sugya in Sanhedrin, let me just. I don't know what's. Not sure if that's going to solve the problem. I don't know enough about technology. Okay. So if you look down again, Reb Chaim is going to bring down all the sources that we quoted, but then he's going to say the following. Let's see if we can find this. Do you see a line that says Zeu Shesosam HaRambam?
Yeah.